Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. It's library data as enterprise data from David Arendodo, Collection Services Librarian from the University of Nebraska at Kearney. A quick logistic, the web chat is open for everyone, but if you have any specific questions for this particular presentation, please use the Q&A box. David, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Ranti. Yeah, I am David Arredondo. Like Ranti said, I'm the collections librarian at University of Nebraska Kearney, and this is my first NASIG conference, and it's been so inspiring so far. So I want to say thank you to all the other presenters and workshop leaders and speakers, and the conference organizers and all the attendees. It's really humbling to get to present alongside such great presentations and folks. So I appreciate being here. My title, I think, is the most boring title of a presentation in the conference today. It's Libraries Data as Enterprise Data. And so I'm going to be covering a lot of material. I'm going to really do my best to leave time for questions, but if I don't get to them, please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to correspond with anybody if I don't get to you at the end. So to get started, what is enterprise data? So enterprise data is adopting the concepts and practices from business analytics and business intelligence to create a framework for thinking about and handling an organization, in our case, a library's data at scale. And so it really considers all or any of the data that our organizations use or produce or manage in the library to do our work. So this can be anything from acquisitions to circulations, space utilizations, reference and instruction, survey responses, external data sources like OCLC, subscription providers like EBSCOnet. And the reason that we consider all the data under this framework is because we're as concerned about the processes and the flow of the data and how we're handling it as we are the actual information that the data might provide to us. And so to kind of keep it in the scope of collections and e-resources, which I think are predominantly the folks here, it might be helpful to think of your collections team or technical services department as a sort of smaller enterprise within a larger enterprise. And we'll talk about scalability at the end, but really we are thinking of any and all data. And enterprise data is also a framework of concepts, tools, techniques, and roles that help us make use of this data. And lastly, a lot of these practices and roles are things that are already happening in our libraries today. We're already using data to inform decisions. We collect it, we clean it, deposit it, report on it. We secure it or hide it for privacy reasons. We do professional development around it, and we serve specific roles. But through a lens of data culture, we're still on the low end, and a lot of our data activities are happening in silos. And so why is there a need for us to be more conscientious of how we're handling our data? First is that there's calls on our institutions that we serve to better use the data. EDUCAUSE is one institution that for many years has been bringing to light the need to better use our data. And most recently in their 2025 Top 10 report, which has a theme of restoring trust in higher education, their number one strategy was called the Data Empowered Institution. So not only do we need to be using data to inform our strategy in a time with low trust in higher education, but we also need to show that we take our data seriously because it revolves around people. The public, which includes our students, faculty, staff, and ourselves, are much more aware of how their data is collected and used and sold. And even though we may not be the large corporations that are systematically exploiting user data for profit, people want to know that their data is being handled with respect, transparency, and privacy. So those are demands on our institutions that we're serving. And also, with these demands, we're being required to increasingly align our collections and services in measurable ways with the overall institution strategy. And a final need that I see is to ensure that we are walking the walk in terms of the data ethics that we endorse. And so much of our LIS research uses enterprise data, which relates to the activities and behaviors of our patrons. And so how can we be sure that we're following our own ethical guidelines? And so a recent study that I might point you to is by Dorothy Salo, published in 2024, titled Data Ethics in Library Learning Analytics in the Journal of Librarianship and Scholarly Communication. And this is an interesting study in looking at how patron data is used in library learning analytics through an ethical lens. So we have a need, we also have a problem. And the problem right now is that in our libraries, we handle our enterprise data and it's disjointed, it's idiosyncratic, it's difficult to replicate our results. It's often incomplete. We're wanting to enhance data from different sources together to get a better picture, but we're unable to do so. We're also gathering data to answer specific questions. And once we answer that question, that data just lives in a folder somewhere and just kind of dies. The system is not robust, so any minor changes can cause major breakdowns in our data flows. And there's a lot of manual work going on here, which introduces a lot of possibilities for errors in our data. And so the goal here is that by thinking of our data from an enterprise standpoint, that we'll have a much more robust data system in our libraries. We'll have defined governance and formal policies and responsibilities. The data that we have will be trustworthy, it'll be replicable, that we're following our ethics, that we're leveraging the existing skills. So even this week, I've heard people mention their Python experts in their library. We're increasing collaboration and deduplicating efforts. So, for example, when we get to a point where you see my data visualizations, you realize that that's not my forte. And so being able to partner with somebody that has a lot more experience in creating effective visuals and reports would really be helpful for me. And last, this system is robust and resilient against change. So in my own case, about a month ago, our Microsoft tenant was migrated to a new tenant and it wiped out all of my work in Fabric and destroyed a lot of my connections in Power BI. But it was actually surprisingly easy to reinstate those things and have my pipelines set back up again. And so we have that kind of resiliency. So a few concepts that I want to touch on before I dive into talking about Fabric and doing some demo are governance, security, sole source of truth, data culture, data storage, and data modeling. These are important underlying concepts in thinking about enterprise data. And so what is data governance? Data governance is a framework and practices to establish trust in our data. So at a high level, it's conceptual, but it's often associated with a role, which would be a data governor or data governance officer. And the goal of governance is to ensure the quality of the data, that's reliable, it's clean, and it's accurate, that we identify stewards. So there's functional experts who are responsible for different data sets, and they are experts in what that data is and how it's produced. That we have access and security controls so that only those people that need to access certain data are able to. And from a policy and compliance standpoint, that we are aligning our practices with policies of our library and also the university that we're serving. What are their IT and risk assessment policies that we would need to follow? And then finally, as I think we would all appreciate, there's metadata management to go along with this. So providing good contextual information to help with data interpretation. So we're not just looking at numbers and assuming what they mean, but we're actually articulating the context of what those numbers can and cannot tell us. Closely aligned with governance is security. And so when we're thinking of data security, we're again thinking about access controls, which I kind of just mentioned, but also authentication processes. So how do we make sure that the people that are accessing the data are who they say that they are? It's also backing up our data. So oftentimes we perform a lot of complex transformations on our data. And so having these backups in case something goes awry, or maybe we lose data, we have backups that we can return to. And security is also concerned with monitoring. So who's accessing the data and what are they doing with it? And so all of this is keeping that data secure because again, it's dealing with real people and their activities. Sole source of truth is the idea that our organization is producing reliable and consistent data, and no matter who you ask, you'll get the same answers. I'm sure we've all had the experiences where if you ask different people for the same data points, you'll get different answers. In fact, I know that I've given people different answers if they ask me a question, 1 month and then 3 months later, it might not be consistent. And so sole source of truth is trying to correct that. And that's through centralizations, the idea that instead of data work happening in silos throughout the library or in our department, that it's moving through a central flow and processes. Consistency is again just making sure that no matter who's asked about a certain data point, they'll get the same answer. Traceability is the idea that you can see where all of the data is coming from, the pathway it goes through, and the things that happen to it before it gets to you. And then finally, it's also the idea of version control, so that you know when the data is enhanced, cleaned, or updated, you'll be able to see that updated date so you know how current your data is. One more concept I think is important to think about is data culture. And there's a lot of different models out there about data culture. I'm going to present here just my own 3 tier, and it kind of depends on which areas, which disciplines you look to, how they talk about data culture. But really, on the low end of a data culture, data practices are siloed. There's no overarching organizational strategy. Data is handled in one-off project fashion. So we answer a question with the data, and then it goes somewhere and is just stored and kind of forgotten about and not used again. There may be pockets of the organization that are handling their data in more sophisticated ways, but there's not a cohesive overarching approach. In a more middle ground of data culture, there is some overarching data strategy, possibly in gathering data in a more systematic fashion. Data is primarily used to explain things that have already happened, but it is helping to inform decision making and is used in communication with stakeholders. And there may be some defined roles or tools like a centralized storage for the data, but it's still not entirely cohesive across the organization. And on the high end, there are defined roles, there's defined storage, software, hardware tools, and data is actively used in decision making and even in daily activities of staff throughout the organization. Data may also be used in a predictive fashion. So you can start to set up machine learning models and things to help predict based on what's happened in the past, what might happen in the future. And so these are organizations that have a really high data culture. And I think that's just helpful to think about to think about maybe where you are or your library or your department would be on this scale. So a couple technical things to kind of define some conceptual technical things to define is data storage. And this happens primarily either in data warehouses or lake houses. And a data warehouse has been around for decades. This is an older form of storing data. And in a warehouse, there's a predefined scheme for all the data that's coming in. And so when you extract your data from a source system, before you can load it into the data warehouse, you have to transform that data to match the schema in the warehouse. And if it doesn't match, it will be rejected. And so it's a bit more of a rigid way of storing your data, but an advantage is data in a data warehouse is ready or nearly ready for analysis. It's been cleaned and it's ready to look at. And a traditional language for interacting with data in a warehouse is SQL. A more recent and more flexible data storage is called a data lake, and this was proposed in a blog post in 2010. And a data lake doesn't operate on a predefined schema, but rather it's by layers. And so at the bottom layer of your data lake, a bronze layer, you would import your raw data. You don't do any transformations. You extract it from the source system and you load it into the data storage, and then you would transform it. And you would transform it as you move it to a silver layer of the data lake. And this is where more cleaned and prepped data lives than what's in the bronze layer. And then finally, the gold layer, the top layer of the lake, which can often be a data warehouse, is where you have your cleaned, prepped data that's ready for analysis living. And so this storage structure is more flexible. It handles raw data in any format. And there's also more flexibility with the language that you would use to interact with the data. You can use things like Python and R besides SQL. And last but not least, the concepts that I wanted to define is data modeling. And this is one of my favorite parts of all of this kind of enterprise data environment and work. And so data modeling is thinking about your data in terms of entities and relationships. And so sometimes entities are measurable things like circulations or usage of online resources or publication or citation information. And other entities can be more descriptive, which would be things like the name of a journal that we're publishing in or using. And then we think about this data in terms of their relationships to each other, and we build those relationships using keys, which are unique identifiers in different data sets, so that we can start to analyze our data. And so by adopting data modeling, it allows us to reuse clean data and enhance other data because we can pull data from different sources. And because of the way we're structuring it, it's a lot easier to combine data from different sources to start to see different pictures. So thinking of some of the presentations that have already happened, this week, we might be thinking about data from OpenAlex, and we might be thinking about data from usage or unpaywall or things like that we might want to pull together to get a fuller view of our publication patterns. And so again, these are just some of the key concepts: governance, security, sole source of truth, data culture, storage, and modeling. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more specifically about Fabric and what it is. So Fabric is Microsoft's data platform where it brings together a bunch of different workloads. So if you're familiar with Power BI, Power BI is one of the workloads that's part of Microsoft Fabric. And so this isn't the only solution to implementing an enterprise data strategy, but it's really nice because it brings everything together into one environment. All your data storage, all your process and handling and reporting and security controls are all in one place. But before I actually go into a demo of what Fabric looks like, I want to take some time to diagram it out into a mental map so you can get an idea of what this data flow might look like and what Fabric looks like. So underlying all of Microsoft Fabric is one lake, and this serves as a storage not just for the data that you bring into Fabric, but also for all of your artifacts like your Spark notebooks, which you would use to write Python code to clean and move your data, or your Power BI and its reports. All of it is stored with this underlying one lake. And so in Fabric, you create workspaces, which allows you to employ governance and access and security because you can define who has access to these workspaces as you build them. So for instance, I might have a workspace that only my department can access because it's departmental data, or I have a workspace that only me and another admin can access because it's raw data that we want to make sure is protected. And so it allows us to have that security. And once you set up a workspace, then you can start to implement your storage strategy. So at the top left, you might see that I install a data warehouse. But at the bottom left, I might go with a lake house, which is that combination of a data lake and a data warehouse. And so in this example that I'm showing, my bottom left workspace is going to serve as a raw data storage for all of my library's data. And this will also help kind of keep a protected archival copy of the data so that even as I manipulate it throughout the rest of the processes, if I need to come back to the original versions, I have a copy of that. Once my storage is set up, I can start to ingest my data from any of my source systems. So in some reporting systems like Alma Analytics, you can configure reports. In some other systems, like if we're gathering counter reports from a vendor's website, you can't really configure those. You just get them as is. But it doesn't matter because we can ingest any kind of data into our storage in our workspaces. And ideally, we would end up doing this through an API auto harvest so that we have the beginning of our pipeline set up to bring in fresh data. Now, once I have my data into my lakehouse, now I want to start cleaning and transporting it by setting up a pipeline. So you can see here what I've done is set up another workspace with another lakehouse, and the arrows show me moving my data tables from one lakehouse to another. In my case, I would be using a Spark notebook, and I'll show you what this looks like, um, to clean and transport the data. And because I'm using notebooks, my cleaning processes are replicable. I can build in data validation. So how do I want to handle null values, or how do I recognize duplicate values in columns that I expect only unique values, and how do I handle those? And I can also automate these transportations and cleanings into a new lakehouse. And somebody commented the handwritten slides are effective. Thank you, because I struggled with doing this in Paint and things, and I finally just said, I'm just going to try to draw this out. And, and I felt like it came out okay. So once I have my data transported and it's clean, now my clean data is ready for modeling, and I can set up my semantic model, which is synonymous with a data model. And what I might do, and what I like to do, is have a central fact table surrounded by dimension tables in a star schema. And what's awesome about data modeling, as we kind of talked about when defining it, is that you can start to enhance data. You can combine data from different sources much more easily than you can in doing more manual Excel-based processes. And once I have a really nice, clean, validated semantic model, now I can just start connecting my Power BI to those models to build reports. And I can do this in different workspaces. So if I have data that I need to report out to different audiences, I can have different workspaces so that access controls are different depending on who needs to get that data. So there's a lot of flexibility with security and reporting out in this type of environment. So with that, I want to actually jump into Microsoft Fabric because I think it's helpful to see what this actually looks like. And if there are any Power BI users out there, some of this should look really familiar. In fact, if you do use Power BI, do you want to just maybe throw your hand up in a raise your hand, or throw up some kind of emoji? I don't know if I'll be able to see everybody. I don't think I'll be able to see the participants. But if you do, good. This will look somewhat familiar. So here I am in Microsoft Fabric, and you can see there's a lot going on here. But if I look off to the left, I have my workspaces, like we kind of already built out. I can see all of my artifacts in the underlying OneLake storage. I can monitor the activities happening in any of my workspaces. And what I'm going to do is navigate to a workspace that I've set up to serve as my library central storage. And so you can see when I'm in here, I have my lake house that I've set up. I have a pipeline, which I'm linking together all of my different notebooks that are pulling the data. In this case, what I'm pulling is all my analytics data through an export incremental notebook here. And I can manage my access. So if I open up my managed access, you'll see only my colleague Matt and I have access to this. Matt helps a lot out with the API calls into the source system and helps me with Python coding. He's amazing. And so if I go into my central storage, we'll see I have it split up into files and tables. And so my files section is what's serving as my bronze layer of my data lake. The data that's coming in here is the raw data, the reports that we've configured in Alma Analytics. We're pulling them out and dropping them in and not doing any transformations along the way. And instead, what I do is then build my Spark notebooks to read in each file, perform any of my transformations and validations, and deposit it into the tables section, which in this case is actually serving as my gold layer of my data lake. Because these files are pretty narrow, I'm skipping that silver layer altogether. I can just do all my cleaning and have those deposited in here ready for use. And so I want to quick show you what the notebooks look like. So if I pop open one of the notebooks here, this is Matt's notebook to do the API call to Alma Analytics. And what he's actually doing with some of the reports are incremental loads because they're really large files. So instead of pulling them all every time, those he's breaking down into incremental loads and loading those in. And then just so you can see what a cleaning notebook looks like. This is one where I'm cleaning up a table for PO lines. So you can see I have it titled dim POL, dim for dimension. And I'm reading it in. And in these notebooks, I can even kind of do some data validation here if I don't want to build it into my code. So I make sure it's all good and then I can deposit it. And so now if I go to a new workspace, this is a workspace that I want to have available to view to everyone in the library. The reports that are going to come out of here, I want liaisons to see, but I also want any curious staff to be able to see what reports are coming in here. So again, I set up a storage. And what I'm doing here is reading those clean tables into this new storage. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm just pointing it at that clean data instead of actually rewriting them and using more storage. But it's here in this different warehouse. And I know it's clean, I know it's validated, and I can start to do my modeling. And so I'm going to pop open my data model here so you can see what this looks like. And so this is what a data model looks like. In my case, I have a central fact table where my transaction amount is the data that I care about. It's the measurable. And I want to understand it in terms of fields that are in my PO line, for instance, any of my reporting codes or a PO line type. I have a separate date table, so that aids in uh, in filtering my data by different dates. Information from fund codes, information about the transaction. So if I want to see transaction types of just encumbrances versus expenditures, and I've modeled this all together. And the reason I've done this, just a quick aside, is because I found in Alma Analytics, when we try to build a report with all the data points that we want, as we start to add in more and more, pretty soon our reports just kind of blow up, become unwieldy, and they're not usable. And so we've struggled for a long time to get those reports out. But instead of doing that, what we've done here is to create much narrower reports, but separate reports with keys that we can use, unique identifiers that we can use to match them together, which makes our report building process a lot easier. In fact, just today, I was able to do a quick edit on a report to include an invoice line for our business manager so that as she's working through her reconciliation procedures, and it took just a matter of a minute for all that to ripple through instead of going back to analytics and wrestling with those reports again. Where's my cursor? There it is. So in this workspace, now I can build my reports. I can connect my Power BI to that semantic model. And so I'll actually show you how that looks real quick. If I'm in Power BI, instead of connecting to an Excel file, I actually can connect to a semantic model, and I can choose the model that I've built. And I want to do that because this data is clean, it's been validated, I know it's good to go, and it's going to be accurate. And if I want to build other reports off of this same data, I can just refer to this same semantic model and connect to it to build my reports. And once my reports are built, then I can start to embed them into SharePoint sites for people uh, to review. Now, something I haven't done here, and like I mentioned earlier, I'm really bad at building dashboards. So you can see that I think these are fairly ugly, and I don't know how usable they are. Something I might consider doing is putting a date stamp on to say when the data is refreshed, so that anybody looking at it knows that the data is current as of, in this case, yesterday, because analytics will take a little bit of time to refresh its data. And I can use that same model to build a completely different report embedded in my department website. And this would have information specifically maybe for my business manager or my serials associate or anybody that needs that data for their reporting purposes. And I can show you things like the monitoring. So this is again where you can build in security. We're a small operation. Our library is not very big, and so we have some flexibility, and I'm not as concerned about that. But I think in larger libraries where you may have more people interacting with data that you build, so if you create a semantic model for a different department, it would be really helpful to be able to see when and how they're using it. And likewise, I can see the usage on embedded reports in SharePoint, so I can understand if people are actually referring to this, which is what I want, because this is the good data. I don't want them coming directly to me and asking for it, because I want to use the data that's good, that's clean, that's been validated by myself and Matt or somebody else, and have them reporting accurate information. So that's what Microsoft Fabric looks like. I'm going to flip back to my slides here because I want to talk a little bit about roles in an enterprise data solution. And I think I'm doing actually really good on time. I was worried I was going to bump right up against 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock, depending on your time zone. I think I'll get through this with time for questions. So some of the roles, first is a data champion. And so this is going to be somebody that's a leader, an administrator, somebody that has clout in the organization that can help to drive that data culture change, that can help to fund professional development, to coordinate events, and just all around encourage the library to move towards a more data centric, or to kind of just think about our data in a different way than we have been. A data architect. So I've been serving some of these functions myself. Um, again, this is usually a higher level person with that understands the technical aspects of enterprise data and overall data governance. They might have close ties with IT, right? Because something like Microsoft Fabric, to turn that license on, you need to have IT to be able to help you with that. But they're going to help design the system. They're going to understand what hardware, what software is available to the library. If it's not Fabric, are there other things that could be used? They help to enforce data governance. And we're going to talk about the end, Jim Gray's 20 queries heuristics, which is a way to kind of go about starting to think about how you would design a system like this. You have a data steward, and these are functional area experts. So this might be your scholarly communications librarian who understands our publication data, who understand open access and what our data sources are, who would be familiar with Ringgold and all those specific things. Or it might be somebody in e-resources who's well versed in counter reports, or an acquisitions person, right? Functional area experts who help to define and provide context and metadata to the data, so that anything that's going out, it's understood what that data means. And these data stewards work very closely with the engineers and analysts. And as you can probably already maybe get, like, these roles are very squishy and there can be a lot of overlap. And so right now, Matt and I are serving in a lot of these roles in our library, again, because we're small, but there can be overlap between all of these. A data engineer. So this is the part that I really enjoy doing. And this is the person who implements what the architect kind of drafts up. Um, thinks of things like data optimization. So earlier I mentioned doing an incremental data load for large data sets. They help to build in the data validation, are probably doing the data modeling or working closely with the data analyst to do the data modeling. And I really enjoy doing this part of it. And then you have your data analysts. These are the folks that are receiving that prepared data and analyzing it. They understand what it can and cannot tell you. They're creating the reports. They're delivering this and communicating it to stakeholders. They may be involved with creating semantic models, but really they're the ones, whoops, that are using that. And these analysts may also be our subject matter experts, consuming the reports, providing contextual information, and serving as a human face of the data. And we are nearing the end. Um, this is this is something that I've only more recently become aware of, and I wish I would have known sooner as I kind of embarked in trying to just have better data practices in our library, particularly starting with collection development and e-resources and acquisitions. And that's Jim Gray's laws. So Jim Gray was a computer scientist in the 90s and early 2000s that was really instrumental in helping the academic and research disciplines build out these large databases that they have now. And so I've kind of adapted these a little bit to think about the library. But the first rule is that academic libraries are becoming increasingly data intensive. I think we can all attest to that. Um, that the solutions are to scale out the architecture. And I think this is really helpful to think of because, when I started, I'm saying this is about all the data. Well, we don't have control over all the data, but we do have control over some of our data. And so we can start to think about how we might use these practices in that smaller environment and then use that to help our library as a whole to scale out that architecture. That we want to bring computations to the data and not vice versa. So earlier I talked about, we have these situations where maybe we have a large scale withdrawal project that we need to do in a short period of time. So we collect all this data, we send it to our librarians for analysis. They do it all. It comes back. We weed everything. We know we need to come back later and do some development in areas that we came across. We're like, wow, maybe our R's in the book collection are really low, or maybe we want to look at the relationship between different things. Um, because we're bringing the data to the computations to the data kind of has one purpose only. And so Jim's law was to start with 20 design queries. You ask people, what are the 20 most important questions that a system like this in our library could answer? And you take those questions from many different people and you start to translate it into entities and relationships, right? So we stop thinking so much about what the data means itself, but what is the data's role? What is it doing? And how does it act in this type of environment? And then the last law is to go from working to working. And so the idea is that, let's say I have reports that are going to a business officer and they need some other data point that's not in my original data set, that I can go to my source system, figure out how to incorporate that into one of the reports. Maybe it's just a field I need to add and have that ripple through without having to shut the whole reporting system down. So we always have some level of working that allows us to build out from this. And so I've mentioned I'm using Microsoft Fabric. It did take quite a bit of time to learn. I started working on it really intensely about a year ago. And it wasn't until probably the end of 2024 that I felt comfortable enough to understand, okay, this is what I want to do, because there's a lot of options that they build in, and it just kind of depends on what skills you have. It's nice because it integrates with an MS365 enterprise account. But it's also, a downside of it is the pricing for it is really opaque. I just don't think it's easy to figure out how much you might pay to kick on the license. And I've been working on a trial license since I started working with this, which is way less than ideal. It kind of gives me heartburn to think about if they decide not to keep renewing my trial over and over again. But it's handy in a presentation like this. And for me, as I'm trying to better understand what are these processes that we're using doing with our data, and how could we be better at it? And so my how is even though this is a lot, and you know, I know the understatement of the year right now is that we're dealing with a lot, right? And so how do we do one more thing? And so what I'm hoping is that maybe this will just help give a little bit of a different perspective as you're working with your data, that you might look at it and see it in a different light, even if we can't, we have so many other competing priorities right now and problems that we're facing. But even just being able to kind of see it in a different way and maybe slowly kind of think of our data practices might really be helpful to us all. And with that, I am done. But I'm happy to take any questions, or I'm also happy to respond to any emails. Just in the last month or so, I've got on Zooms with folks from other institutions to kind of walk through like Power BI and how that works and stuff. I'm happy to do those things as time permits. I really love doing this stuff, but I really also want to give back to all of you, because I've had such a great time at this conference and just at all the library conferences too. So yeah, questions.
This is excellent, David. Thank you so much. You inspire me to explore possibilities in my institution. We have a couple
Thank
of
you.
questions. How many others in your library are using the data to create their own reports?
So right now I'm making reports for people. Right now, I'm focusing on just trying to build up good updated reporting on our book order funds, so that people know what they're spending and how they're hitting their different allocations. So that's my first goal in terms of people outside of my department. So those are going to the liaison librarians. And then also reporting for internally, because our business manager just has such a hard time getting the data out of analytics and matching it up with SAP. And so trying to figure that out so that her work is a lot easier. So I'm really building the reports at this point. But I just hired a person that I think will be really interested in this. So hopefully continue to expand out.
And how do you share the reports? Like SharePoints, live guides, something else?
I just embed them in SharePoint. A lot of our folks though don't particularly like or seem proficient at going to SharePoint. It's something I've been familiar with. So I might consider other ways. I try to encourage them just to bookmark it and to go to it. But it's also been a struggle this semester, because I mentioned we migrated our Microsoft tenant, and it really kind of blew everything up for a little bit there, right when we're getting near the end of our spending period. So it was a little bit of an issue there, because then I just had to take the time to go back and kick the pipelines back on. But that's how I'm doing it, is in SharePoint.
Uh, Do you have a data retention policy?
No, no. And I think that's a really important question to be able to answer. And that's something that by kind of thinking it in this way, I think we'll be forced to think about, how long do we retain this data, or is there data we don't want to collect?
I think this is going to be last question. Does your library use ALMA? And how is ALMA Analytic insufficient for your needs?
We do use Alma and analytics. One of the ways is, like I've kind of mentioned, like we've just really struggled with getting a report out of it to help with reconciliation, especially with reconciliation that our business officer can use. And and I honestly haven't had as much time to really dig into it over the last like 6 months for several reasons. But that I also struggle with the counter reports, and thinking of how the usage information comes out and what happens to it after it goes in and comes out is kind of opaque, because sometimes it doesn't line up, and coming up with things like cost per use, I think are um, things that I would want to spend a little bit more time being able to validate myself.
All right. I think we are at time. Thank you so much, David. This is an excellent presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. Our next session, it's going to be, this is a break and then there's a snapshot session at 3:15. So thank you again.
Thank you.